everyone, and welcome to Art of Citizenry Podcast, where we navigate the complexities of doing good in an unequal world. I am your host and in-house educator, Manpreet Kalra. Throughout this podcast, we have explored the power of language and words. As many of you know, I strongly believe that words have the ability to shape perception and are an important part of how we share not only our stories, but shape the way others understand our experiences. Unfortunately, the conversation of language is often approached from a subconscious place of dominance. We don't necessarily realize how language itself can play into how we experience and navigate power. English is the most spoken language in the world, with Mandarin following as a close second. The thing that is important to note as a difference between the two is that while the majority of Mandarin speakers are concentrated by region, English is much more spread out. This is, of course, the result of colonization of communities around the world by the British Empire. After all, it was the, quote, empire on which the sun never sets. This idea of English being the language of dominance continued to manifest with the spread of American culture, with English being the primary language of the original colonizers of what is now the United States. The association of English and whiteness became stamped. The persistent idolization of whiteness, as evidenced through the tragic history of slavery in the U.S., further cemented the roots of internalized racism, leading to English taking a dominant hold. English is the de facto language of 70 countries and is the official language of the skies. It has more non-native speakers than any other language in the world. Historically, power, specifically political and social power, is intrinsically tied to the ability to speak the dominant language. It has resulted in the loss of culture, which is very much dependent on the survival of languages, many of which are now endangered. The drift away from language often starts for understandable reasons, like a desire to assimilate or even survive. This is something I've seen firsthand in my own community. Punjabi, being the language of my ancestors, has become increasingly endangered after years of ridicule as the language of uneducated villagers. Many in Punjab itself choose not to speak Punjabi out of a desire to assimilate and be treated with respect by India's elite, who speak Hindi and hold power and prestige. Even schools in Punjab that once taught in Punjabi now teach in Hindi. It is important to understand this context, especially as I speak to you right now in English, my second language, a fact I've shied away from sharing out of fear of being considered less than. So how do you tell a story that transcends the barriers of power that language often creates within society? Over the years, I have come to recognize the power that art has as a universal language. No matter what culture or community you belong to, art has the ability to communicate the nuances that often language fails to when navigating across cultures. During this episode, we will be speaking with Eunice Pais, the founder of Pais Ethical Image Making. Eunice is a self-taught ethical fashion photographer based in Portugal. Her journey in photography started 3 years ago with the question, can photography be responsible? Partnering with ethical fashion brands, Eunice was able to develop and implement environmentally and socially positive methods of work in her fashion productions. This year, she decided to elevate the initial personal project even further by creating an agency that champions ethics in image making while pushing for a more equitable industry. She will be sharing her experience with her Black-Portuguese identity, the impact of colonization on her identity, and together we will explore the role of photography in storytelling.
When I started practicing photography and trying different photographic techniques, at some point I asked if photography could be responsible, if it could be done in an environmentally friendly way, more inclusive. I thought, okay, if I want to be more ethical, maybe I should collaborate with brands and entities that also are in the same journey or a similar journey or with the same purpose. Luckily, I was super embraced and it was amazing, such a learning experience. I mean, I learned about supply chain, about social justice, environmental justice, and so on. And that's how I started. But then as I worked with more fashion brands, I realized that ethical fashion brand as a title or as a label can mean many things. So I took a little pause and I decided to create my own protocol of ethics as a photographer so that I could also not just work for ethical fashion brands, but work with ethical fashion brands and push the sustainability narrative and elevate it to a way that photography is not only an ally, but it's also its own agent. And together we can bring forth the equitable world that we are striving for.
When I entered the ethical and sustainable space, I was taken aback by the lack of diversity, and I believe this reason for exclusivity has many layers. There is the aspect of what I call the hipster repackaging, where sustainable practices that have been integral to many communities of color for generations are now being co-opted for your stereotypical white hipster at an inaccessible cost and with an exclusionary narrative that makes sustainability feel almost unobtainable. How do you navigate this perception as a photographer with an intersectional identity?
When I started photographing, I realized that there was like this ideal of what an ethical, sustainable fashion consumer would look like. And all of those images, all sort of the target audience, whatever, was very British and American based, which that was the first time that I asked, so we're not creating for Portugal. We're not creating for the Portuguese. We're probably creating for this idea that we have of who consumes what. And that sort of made me step back in terms of, okay, so for me to represent the narratives that are actually ethical and sustainable, I also have to sort of understand what my identity is and make that very present in the conversations.
You know, one of the things I really struggle with is that many of the mainstream conversations taking place around issues such as sustainability are taking place through an English language framework, which only furthers that inaccessibility I was referring to earlier. I do believe part of the reason this is happening is because of the role social media platforms such as Instagram play in these conversations. But even beyond sustainability, one of the things you have mentioned to me earlier is how even conversations around intersectional identities are often captured through the filter of the English language. What are your thoughts on the multidimensional aspect of race and identity, especially through a non-American and non-English speaking lens?
I started looking at myself first, but I soon understood that in terms of the conversation, it's a bit more developed, or it's at a stage that people get it quicker in English-based countries. English-speaking countries, I should say. Which in on itself, in my opinion, it's sort of a post-colonialism, colonialism kind of thing, which is probably not really thoughtful, but it just happens. It's the language of business. So it only makes sense that it's something that it's mostly spoken in English. Therefore, if you want to have access to it, you have to speak that language. So that was the first time that I actually thought about language and identity. Okay, so access. So maybe because Portugal doesn't have as much funding or funds or economical power, maybe that's why brands are doing the things that they're doing the way that they're doing, which is fine. But then this year, with sort of the second wave of the Black Lives Matter and with everything that has happened, I was having this conversation with a friend of mine who's British. She's Black British. And we were just talking about our experience as Black women. What is it like? What is it not like? And we soon realized that most narratives about the Black experience, American-centric or very British-centric, which again, it's not something that is probably conscious collectively, but it does happen. And sometimes I feel like I, in a way, am privileged because I speak English fluently, so I can convey my experience and my messages clearly in two languages. But if someone doesn't, then their experience as a person of color who doesn't speak English is sort of not included in the conversation. And that person will have to find their own space with his or her or their language, which is perfect. It's amazing because we have to do this in different scales and with different nuances and include different narratives with their own cultural specificities. But I often wonder if the access is all in myself as a photographer. I experienced this. Most people who I work with are from the Commonwealth. And I wonder if language itself and the access that language gives isn't tied to colonialism. Even though I speak Portuguese, but Portugal was a heavy colonizer back in the days, but it's not now the most spoken language for business or for whatever. For education, for example, even here in Europe, if you want to apply for a university overseas, you have to speak English. You must speak English. Sometimes we forget that our narratives, our experiences are also language-based, because that's how the brain works. And when we say this is the experience, we are forgetting so much in so many people who don't have access to that language to tell their experience. That's why I love photography so much, because it sort of shuts that down and goes deeper into what really can be said without that barrier that was imposed to us. My parents are Mozambican. They lived through colonialism. They fled their country because of colonialism. And I often wonder, what language would they speak if it wasn't for that? And would I be able to express so much more? Because if we think about our ancestors and the level of the wealth of knowledge, the wealth of skills that we still can recognize, even though several attempts of wiping those cultures out, I imagine how rich language would be.
You touched on this a bit earlier. I am curious how you have navigated your identity. You mentioned in the past that you identify as Black-Portuguese, which isn't necessarily recognized by those around you. Can you talk a little about what that means and how your Portuguese identity was shaped growing up?
To me, it means the world, but there's no expression like that in Portuguese, so I can't translate it. And when I say, if we were having this conversation in Portuguese and you were Portuguese, most probably I would say I'm Black-Portuguese, and you would say, no, you're just Portuguese, because that's the mentality. You're either Portuguese or you're not Portuguese. Up until I was 18, 19, I would say I'm Portuguese. That's it, because that's what I was taught. Even though at school, in my experience, people will always ask me, oh, but you're not Portuguese because you're Black. I'm like, yeah, but I was born here, so I am Portuguese. And people would ask me where my parents are from to sort of understand my heritage. So people will say, oh, you're African descent, which is accurate. But considering that when growing up, and again, my parents did their best to protect me and my brother, and they knew that the more Portuguese we looked and sound, the better, more access we would have. And I do not hold them into any sort of shame. It was just life, and life is hard. If you're a parent, you protect your kids at all costs, and that's life. Everything around our household was as Portuguese as possible, even though we were very curious about our relatives and whatnot. And some relatives embraced more their Mozambican culture than, for example, my parents probably did. I grew up in a Portuguese household, culturally speaking, we ate Portuguese food more often. If sometimes my mom would cook Indian food because she was very close to my grandmother, and unfortunately, when she passed away, she couldn't go back to Mozambique to bury her. So I think she, through her culinary, sort of paid homage to my grandmother. So there was like no Mozambican food in the house, no Mozambican music. There was no cultural aspects that I could say, oh, okay, I identify as that. So for me, I was Portuguese until I went to the UK, and, my friends were like, oh, I'm Black British, I'm Ghanaian, I'm Greek, I'm this. And I'm like, but what does that mean? So you were born here in Britain, in the UK, but you have all these definitions of self, which is amazing. But for me, it was a shock. They would ask me, it's like, I'm Portuguese. Yeah, but Portuguese from where? Where do you identify yourself from? I'm like, I'm Portuguese, full stop. And as soon as I started diving into those conversations, like in some households, for example, my Greek friends, everything was Greek. They kept the language, they kept everything. So outwardly, they would speak English, but at home, it was full on Greek. For the others was Ghanaian. The others were sort of Blackness was more about their identity itself, and then nationality later. So Black British. And that got me to think, oh, wow, there's so many nuances of myself that I've been rejecting and that have been rejected culturally. And I thought, okay, I was born in Portugal. I embrace Portuguese culture. It is my culture. But I'm Black Portuguese. I'm also a Black woman. And that's really important because that will then translate into my ancestors, into my disruptive way of thinking, into my way of thriving in hostile places, into my way of operating, the way I think about an issue that usually is very white-centric, and I can go even deeper into things. So I'm Black Portuguese.
One of the things many people don't realize is that colonization also resulted in forced migration. It was as much about power through expansion as it was about the annihilation of communities and cultures. This meant that many people were forced to move to countries where they continued to live in endangerment. People were forced to assimilate, abandoning their identities for the sake of survival. For those who are not familiar with the history of colonization in Mozambique, can you share a little bit about your family's experience?
So between 1964 and 1974, Mozambique was at war with Portugal, or the Portuguese government, for independence. So it's called the War of Independence, or Portuguese Colonial War, because Mozambique until 75 was a country colonized by Portugal. So that meant that since this war for freedom or for independence of Mozambique started, the militia that started this conflict was very clear that anybody who was Portuguese or considered themselves Portuguese or had Portuguese identification, meaning passport and ID card, whichever was used at the time, was not welcomed. Meaning that whatever, in my case, in my family case, especially maternal, whatever my grandfather did to protect my family during colonial time was now seen as an affront to the Mozambican culture. So my family basically had to flee their own country because they didn't choose their nationality. They had no agency to choose. They were under strict dictatorship. They came to Portugal in 1974 with a nationality that wasn't well received here. So they came to the country that colonized them and yet did not accept them as Portuguese. So for all purposes, even nowadays, my dad died when I was young. So even now, when my mom shows her ID, it's still met with question, oh, so you're Portuguese, or are you really Portuguese? And there's this disregard about history, which wasn't that long ago. So people who fought in that war are still alive. People who felt the consequences of that war are still living. And yet, my mom being Portuguese is disconcerting.
Thank you so much for sharing that very personal anecdote. I think recognizing these stories is critical to actually dismantle the colonial systems we operate in. I would like to dive deeper into one of the things you mentioned earlier, how the inaccessibility and barriers that language creates inspired your work as a photographer. I do believe photography is incredibly powerful because it has the ability to capture a story and build connections at a very raw, humanistic level. Going off of what you were mentioning earlier about the Black experience, I am curious to hear what role you think photography plays on how people perceive communities and cultures.
The way I see it, at the moment, we're going about it the wrong way, which is, and I understand there's this social anxiety of showing that us, Black, Brown, Indigenous people of color are being heard. Therefore, a lot of photographers work with Black models or brown models or, Indigenous, but people of color in general. And I get it, but the way I see it, that's not even the tip of the iceberg. That's actually just a trend. So I think we need to start asking ourselves that when we think about creating something with a brand or with an entity, where does that story start and where does it stem from? So sometimes for me, I look at a brand and I think, okay, this seems to me like this is something that I would work with this type of people or this crew or to convey this story. But we also have to understand that, and I know there's a lot of conversation about cultural appropriation, cultural appreciation. But if I'm not invited to the culture that I may or may not like and don't belong, the best thing that I can do is just to observe as a ways of respecting. So I'm very careful with, I love all cultures, but I'm not just going to put someone in front of the camera to show that to desperately show that I am inclusive and I am equitable, because that's not the way to go about it. So I think from the creative standpoint from before even clicking on Pinterest and creating a mood board, make sure that you are accountable. Make sure that you understand the consequences of the stories that you are perpetuating. Image is everything. and it stays forever. Every image that I take, every photo that I take and I put out there will outlive me. And I need to understand that. I need to understand that but when my voice is gone, my images will stay. So what is it that I'm saying? Am I saying that sustainability is just for the white person, for the 24-year-old white girl, for what is it that I'm saying? What is it that I'm perpetuating? What narrative am I participating in? Am I saying that this brand is for, or now the Black experience through this brand is just for people in their 20s or in their 30s, and erase generations and generations of people who have struggled and thrived and struggled again and got killed, so that I could be able to tell this story. So what is it that I'm doing? So every step of my creative process is sort of understanding that I have my own identity, I have my own artistic vision, but I work with people. So I need to understand, how am I doing people's justice in whatever I do?
So does language then limit creativity?
I feel that because of the evocative premise of images, whoever is observing can create their own story of where that image came about, which is one of the most fascinating things, because if you're reading a book, fiction or nonfiction, if you're listening to something, language is interfering, language is creating, it's sort of non-directly creating symbolisms in your mind. And you're going to interpret that sentence, that tone, if it's something listened to, whoever you are, according to whoever you are in the references you have. So really, it's a limitation, because it's sort of you're giving input to your brain to sort of because our brains are limited, to put things in a box so that you understand what you're reading and what you're hearing. And I think with images, you look at something and you can come up with whatever you want. Emotions that you probably didn't think of. You can think about places that you've never been. You can wonder why this image, why this story. So even though there is language, because you're thinking in a language, the only input that is given is through that frame. And there's nothing else. In whatever you want to project, and however you want to expand on it, it's you. And I think that's just so powerful and it's so beautiful. And I couldn't have picked a better career. But as a professional, not observer, as a maker, it's also a disservice to think about language when creating an image. So for example, obviously I do briefs, I have meetings with clients and whatnot, but once everything is okay, I shut it down. I barely give directions to my models because I don't want my limitations to limit them. So it's just us and nature and the sounds of nature, not the sounds of words that were constructed by people, and we didn't probably subscribe to it. So it's just us. It's what is there. And that gives me such creative freedom and such joy and such power as well, that I don't think if I had to put words, I would be able to.
It's not uncommon for photography in the ethical space to further binary narratives about who makes products versus who consumes them, often creating great inequities. What responsibility do ethical photographers hold as visual storytellers?
Us as photographers, when we document the supply chain and who makes our clothes, we also have to think about, which story am I perpetuating? Am I breaking a narrative? Am I contributing to narrative? Is that narrative toxic? Is that narrative positive? will that narrative do justice to the people? It is a power to work the land and plant seeds that then become jackets. It is a power to process that in an environmentally friendly way. It is a power to make beautiful garments. Let's not forget that fashion is an art form as well. It's a celebration. It is power. So if I'm documenting this, am I giving the power back, or am I taking away for gain, profit, or to feed the fantasies of those with power?
We spoke a bit earlier about sustainability and access, but sustainability means so many different things to different people. Can you touch upon what sustainability means to you and how it plays out in the work you do?
What I feel at the moment is happening is sustainability, obviously, it's still a new subject in terms of language. Again, language sustainability is a new term. It doesn't mean that it's newly practiced or it's a new practice. It is not. We know this because it's ancestral and it stems from indigenous cultures. So, but as a word, it's new. As a concept in the mainstream, is fairly new. In my case, sustainability is developing frames of work and bodies of work that understand the intersection between environment and social justice. So that means that when I think about carrying a photo shoot, I think about obviously the environment. If I need that much, those many things, those many props, those many people, if I need to travel people or not, if I can downsize in terms of impact. And in a social stance, how can I empower? How can I create regenerative systems of opportunities that then bring wealth to people? And that wealth can then be regenerated through more opportunities of work. And ultimately, and this is why I love visual storytelling, sustainability now seems very political, but it is a societal issue. And historically speaking, art has always had a play in that. As artists, we've always documented very specific societal issues that occurred in eras. We have feminism, waves of feminism, we have marriage, love. These are topics that are explored through artistic lens all the time because they're societal issues. They affect us. Each generation is affected by issues all the time. And because sustainability is such a broad issue, it's my responsibility as an artist to also explore it through an artistic lens and to dive deeply into what that means, what that could possibly mean. And because it is art, we can create worlds of how it looks like. And not many people can say that. So to just be an afterthought or a freelancing gig after the product is made is not just. And we need to start thinking that we're not just the service that a brand requires for certain industries. We're not just a bunch of images for an art gallery. If that gallery is funded by money that comes from exploitation and oppression, we're not just that. We're an industry with its own agency. We are our own agents. So we need to step up.
As you were speaking, it made me think about how even the word sustainability is an English language word. Not to say that other languages don't have a word of equivalence or won't in the future as languages do evolve, and yet a concept that is rooted in indigenous cultures is now being owned by a culture that has just discovered the critical importance of thinking about how we navigate through life more sustainably. So while from an English pop linguistic standpoint, sustainability is new, the concept of sustainability has been around for generations.
Language is so tricky because it's very much necessary. But it impedes of so much. If we were just observers, more observers than speakers and readers, if we observed people, there's communities, the systems that people themselves in the community create to thrive, we would have gotten sustainability like years ago. we would have been able to have a society and societies that have these principles, the access of language. But because we need to name things first to understand them later, it's like what's happening in photography. You put a black body in the front of a camera first before you address what really is going on. And language sometimes does that. We need a name. And then we can start thinking, this definition or this words represents this, but this has been here for a while. My parents always reused and repurposed everything. It's like a no-brainer.
It's so funny that you say that. I shared this a bit earlier on Instagram, but all of my mom's outdoor planters are reused yogurt containers. The idea of repurposing and reusing is not foreign to her or my father. Actually, my husband's father used to use film canisters to store pins, change, and so forth. In fact, we still have some of those film canisters, I believe, at our place too. With that said, I do want to take a moment before we wrap up to hear about the exciting project you have been working on. Tell us about your agency.
When you see a label, you have to understand the biases that come with that label, your internal biases and societal biases. So if you may see something that is made in the country that you live, let's say made in the UK, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the work from the people who made the garments was not non-exploitative, as opposed to if you see a label made in Nepal, you don't immediately assume that was made by children or by a very poor brown family and who struggles. And so we need to understand which narratives we tell ourselves, because the more we tell these narratives, they become belief systems, and those are very difficult to break. So what I think is happening now is that there is still a lot of dehumanization about what work is behind a garment. And I think some ethical fashion brands are doing amazing work in that. But then the story ends once the product is made. And then we jump immediately to consumer responsibility. But for the consumer to get access to, at least to know what the garment looks like, there needs to be an image. So that's when photography comes into play. And my question was always, so how can photography be an ally of this? And that's when I had this idea of creating my own agency to have, so that photography has its own agency in terms of the narratives that we want to tell as artists, but also by being accountable and being transparent in doing work that doesn't harm neither people or the planet. We can also start demanding accountability in the industries that we collaborate with. And so I am developing a pledge system that elevates both creatives in photography and brands, so that we collaboratively and in an accountable and transparent way can actually reach to our sustainable goals.
With that, I want to thank all of the listeners for tuning in to today's episode, and extend a special thank you to Eunice for joining me today and sharing her valuable insights. Please be sure to check out the show notes for links to follow and support her work. Also, be sure to check out her GoFundMe. To learn more about Art of Citizenry and for information on future webinars and workshops, please visit artofcitizenry.com. You can also find me on Instagram at Manpreet Kalra. Please remember to subscribe to Art of Citizenry Podcast on your favorite listening app. And of course, 5 stars on iTunes are always welcomed. From here in Seattle, sending positive and healthy vibes your way.